Cameron West stepped out of his sleek black car, greeted by a buzz of excitement outside the old brick orphanage. It was the annual charity event he hosted every year, a cause close to his heart, though it was more about reputation than personal connection. The cameras flashed, reporters jostled for attention, but Cameron's well-practiced smile never wavered. He adjusted the cuffs of his expensive suit, his sharp eyes scanning the scene. Children laughed and played, oblivious to the significance of the day. Volunteers rushed around, organizing everything. For a moment, Cameron felt detached, like a stranger among the crowd. As he made his way toward the main building, the unexpected happened. "Hey, I know you." A tiny voice cut through the chatter. Cameron paused mid-step. His head turned instinctively toward the source. A little girl, no older than 6, with wide blue eyes and pigtails that bounced as she ran toward him. She was breathless, her small face flushed with excitement. "I know you," she repeated, her voice higher now. "You're in my picture." Cameron blinked, taken aback. "Your picture?" he asked, crouching down to her level, his confusion evident. The girl nodded eagerly. "Yes, my mommy showed me," she said. "She said you're important." He couldn't help but smile at her innocence. "Your mommy? Huh? And what's her name?" he asked, trying to be polite, though the confusion only deepened. "Mia." The girl's smile widened. "I'm Mia. Mommy's name is Emily. She has a picture of you, and she says you're special." Cameron's expression shifted. The name Emily rattled through his mind like a distant echo, but it didn't immediately register. There had been many Emilys over the years, names, faces, fleeting memories. But something about this little girl's intensity unsettled him. A volunteer approached, sensing the odd exchange. "Mr. West, is everything all right?" she asked, looking at Mia with concern. Cameron straightened up, his professional mask slipping back into place. "Yes, it's fine," he assured her, glancing down at Mia again. "But can we find out more about this child's mother?" The volunteer hesitated but nodded. "I'll look into it." Mia tugged on Cameron's sleeve, her wide eyes shimmering with an almost desperate hope. "You'll see Mommy soon, right? You'll tell her I'm doing good?" Before he could answer, a wave of confusion crashed over him. Why did this child think she knew him? Why did her mother, Emily, have his picture? And why was there a flicker of recognition when she mentioned that name? Cameron turned to the volunteer, his voice quieter now. "Can I talk to someone in charge here? I need to understand what's going on." The woman nodded, clearly sensing that this was no ordinary request. She gestured toward the main building. "Follow me, Mr. West. Let's see if we can find some answers." As they walked away, Mia's voice echoed behind them, small but filled with certainty. "I know you'll help. Mommy said you always help." Cameron glanced back over his shoulder at the little girl, her innocent faith in him tugging at something deep inside. He didn't know why, but this encounter wasn't something he could just brush off. Something about it felt familiar. The volunteer led him into the office, where a few members of the staff were discussing logistics for the event. One of the senior supervisors greeted Cameron with a warm, practiced smile, but before she could delve into pleasantries, Cameron cut to the chase. "There's a little girl here, Mia. She says her mother, Emily, showed her a picture of me," he began, his voice calm but with a tinge of urgency. "I need to know. How do I know this Emily?" The supervisor's smile faltered. She exchanged a glance with one of her colleagues, her face becoming serious. "Mia? Oh yes, Mia. Her mother, Emily, passed away some years ago." Cameron felt his stomach drop. Passed away? He hadn't expected that. When? 7 years ago. It was sudden. But Mia has been with us ever since. Cameron's mind raced. 7 years ago? And now this child, standing in front of him, claiming she knew him from a picture? Something didn't add up. His chest tightened. Emily. Was she someone I knew? I mean, really knew? Cameron's voice wavered slightly as memories fought to surface. The supervisor nodded slowly, her eyes softening. Emily was a young, talented writer. She used to talk about someone who helped her get her start. But after well, things became complicated. Mia was left in our care, and we've been looking after her since. Cameron stepped back, the pieces beginning to fall into place, but the full picture remained elusive. Emily, he whispered, the name once again clawing at the edges of his memory. And then it hit him. Emily wasn't just anyone. She had been more than an acquaintance. But how deep had their connection gone? And why couldn't he remember? As Cameron stared blankly at the worn walls of the office, one thought echoed in his mind, drowning out everything else. Could Mia really be his? Cameron sat in his office late into the night, the dim light of his desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. The usually comforting scent of old leather-bound books and fresh coffee did little to ease the growing tension in his chest. His mind kept looping back to that name, Emily, and the innocent blue eyes of the little girl who had shattered the walls of his carefully constructed life earlier that day. Emily, he whispered to himself again, rolling the name on his tongue like a long-forgotten melody. His fingers tapped anxiously on the oak desk, the rhythm picking up speed as the memories he had long buried started to claw their way to the surface. There had been an Emily, a young woman he had known years ago, a writer with fiery ambition and a spark that had drawn him in. She was talented, perhaps more talented than she had ever realized. Cameron had seen something in her, a spark, a potential for greatness. He remembered helping her get published, pulling strings in the literary world that had opened doors for her. But it had been professional, nothing more. Or had it? His mind was clouded, as if those memories were pieces of a puzzle that had been thrown into a dark corner of his life, deliberately forgotten. There was something else, something deeper, about his connection with Emily, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't grasp it. It felt like trying to catch smoke with his hands. The soft chime of his phone broke through his thoughts. A text from James, his old friend and colleague in the publishing industry, who had agreed to help him dig into Emily's past. James, got some info. Emily Dawson. Ring any bells? Cameron felt his heart skip a beat. Dawson. That was her last name. The fog in his mind began to clear, but only just. He quickly texted back, yes? Anything else? A few moments later, another message popped up. James. She disappeared 7 years ago. No one knows why. I've got people who remember her. Apparently, she dropped out of the scene without a word. Real mysterious. Cameron rubbed his eyes, the weight of the revelation pressing down on him. 7 years. That was a long time for someone to vanish. He stood up, pacing the length of his office as James sent more details, each text pulling Cameron deeper into the past. James, apparently, you two were close. Real close. I'm surprised you don't remember. Or maybe you just blocked it out. Cameron froze mid-step, the words hanging in the air. He hadn't wanted to forget anything. Had he? His mind was a battlefield of scattered fragments now, glimpses of Emily's face, her laughter, and the way she had looked at him with a mixture of admiration and something else, something more intimate. Sinking back into his chair, Cameron clicked on an attachment James had sent, a photo of Emily from one of her book launches. The moment his eyes landed on the image, a rush of emotions flooded him. There she was, standing on a stage, holding her first published book with a radiant smile, eyes sparkling with the promise of a bright future. But the flood of emotions didn't stop there. Suddenly, it all came rushing back, the parts of the story he hadn't wanted to face, the parts he had buried under layers of success, work, and the passage of time. They had been more than just colleagues. Much more. The next morning, Cameron drove through the city, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. His destination was the publisher's office that had once worked with Emily. He needed answers, real answers, and the only people who might know more about Emily were the ones who had been there during her last days in the industry. As he entered the sleek, modern building, he was greeted by familiar faces. Old colleagues, friends of friends, people who had once been part of Emily's world. The receptionist gave him a curious look, but quickly ushered him into a small conference room where he would meet with a few of Emily's old acquaintances. The room felt cold despite the bright daylight pouring through the large windows. Cameron sat stiffly in the chair, his mind swirling with questions. How much had he missed? Why had Emily disappeared without a trace? And why hadn't he realized how deep their connection truly was? The door opened, and two people walked in. Mark, an editor who had worked closely with Emily, and Linda, a literary agent who had handled her early career. Their expressions were guarded, as if they knew more than they were willing to say. Cameron, Mark greeted him with a nod. Long time. Yeah, Cameron replied, his voice thick. Thanks for agreeing to meet with me. I just need to understand what happened. With Emily, Mark exchanged a glance with Linda, who shifted uncomfortably in her seat. It was Linda who spoke first. You two were close, weren't you? She asked cautiously, her gaze piercing. I mean, before she disappeared? Cameron hesitated, not entirely sure how to answer. We were friends, but I've been hearing things that make me think there was more to it. Linda's eyes softened slightly. Emily admired you, Cameron. She spoke about you often, even before she got published. But then, after a while, she just stopped talking about you altogether. She stopped talking to anyone, really? Mark leaned forward, his voice low. She left the industry without warning. She just vanished. There were rumors, of course. People said she had gone into hiding. Others thought she might have, well, something worse. The weight of Mark's words settled heavily in the room, and Cameron felt a cold chill run down his spine. You mean she might have been in trouble? Mark nodded. There were whispers. Nothing concrete. But a few months before she disappeared, Emily seemed different, more withdrawn, anxious. She stopped trusting people. I tried to reach out, but she pushed everyone away. Cameron's mind was reeling. None of this made sense. The Emily he remembered was strong, driven, fearless. What could have happened to make her retreat so completely from the world? He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. So, no one knows what really happened to her. Linda shook her head. Not exactly. But there's one thing we do know. She pulled out a small file and slid it across the table toward Cameron. He opened it to find several letters, all addressed to him. They were dated nearly 7 years ago, just before Emily's disappearance. She sent these, Linda explained softly. We found them among her things after she was gone. They were never mailed. Cameron's hands trembled as he picked up the first letter, his heart racing with each word. Emily had been trying to reach him, trying to tell him something important, but for some reason, he had never received her final words. Why? As he scanned the pages, the words blurred in front of his eyes, but one phrase stood out, burning itself into his mind. I didn't want to tell you, but you deserve to know. I have a daughter, and she's yours, Cameron. Cameron dropped the letter as the truth hit him like a freight train. Cameron sat motionless in the dimly lit room, the words on the letter ringing in his head like an echo he couldn't escape. I have a daughter, and she's yours, Cameron. The paper trembled in his hands, but it wasn't just the letter. It was everything that followed those words, the weight of a revelation that shattered every assumption he'd ever had about his life. A daughter. He took a shaky breath and ran his fingers through his hair, trying to process the bombshell Emily had left behind. Mia, the little girl who had recognized him from a picture. She was his. The realization sank deeper with each passing second, his chest tightening, his thoughts spiraling. For 6 long years, he had lived unaware of this, oblivious to the fact that somewhere out there, he had a child. How could he not have known? How could Emily have kept something like this from him? And more importantly, why? The questions came in rapid succession, each one more painful than the last. He had missed her first steps, her first words, the joy and the struggle of raising her. And now, he was being forced to catch up, to understand a reality he had been completely cut off from. His phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was James. James, you okay, man? Did you get the letters? Cameron stared at the message for a long moment before responding. Yeah, I got them. His fingers hovered over the keys, unsure what to say next. How did you even begin to explain this? He let out a sigh and typed another message, this time more honest. Mia? She's my daughter, isn't she? A few moments passed, and then the reply came. James, looks like it. I didn't want to say anything before you saw the letters. Must be a lot to take in. A lot to take in was an understatement. Cameron stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the wooden floor as he began pacing the length of the room. He felt a storm brewing inside him, a combination of anger, guilt, and disbelief. His mind raced back to Mia, her bright blue eyes, the way she had looked up at him with a kind of certainty he hadn't understood at the time. Of course, she had known. Somehow, children always knew. What had Emily been thinking? Why hadn't she told him? Why hadn't she given him the chance to be there for Mia, to be a father? Hours later, Cameron found himself in a sleek medical office, waiting for the results of the DNA test. He had insisted on confirming it, despite everything he had read in Emily's letters. Part of him still needed undeniable proof that Mia was his. He couldn't allow himself to fully believe it until he had the facts in front of him. The sterile smell of antiseptic filled the room, mixing with the soft hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. His leg bounced restlessly, nerves stretched thin as he waited. The test had been taken earlier that morning, and now he sat alone, his heart pounding against his ribcage as if it were trying to escape. The door creaked open, and a nurse stepped in, a thin folder in her hand. Her face was neutral, as it had been when she first took the sample, but Cameron could see the flicker of something behind her eyes. Sympathy, maybe? She knew. Everyone in the room knew, except him. "Mr. West," she began, her voice professional but gentle. "The results are ready." He swallowed hard, his throat dry as he nodded for her to continue. The nurse handed him the folder, but the moment it touched his hands, he hesitated. This was it, the moment everything would change. He stared at the folder for what felt like an eternity, the weight of his own fears pressing down on him. And then, with trembling hands, he opened it. 99.9% probability of paternity. Cameron's breath left him in a sharp exhale, as though all the air had been sucked from the room. He closed the folder and leaned back, his head spinning. There it was, the proof he had both dreaded and longed for. Mia was his daughter. There was no running from it now. The nurse quietly excused herself, leaving Cameron alone with the reality he could no longer deny. His hands gripped the edges of the folder, his mind racing through a whirlwind of emotions. Shock, guilt, anger, and, beneath it all, an overwhelming sense of loss. He had missed so much. He had lost years with her, years that could never be recovered. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from the orphanage. "Orphanage, Mia's been asking about you. Are you coming to see her soon?" Cameron stared at the screen, his heart pounding in his chest. The question, simple as it was, made his throat tighten. Mia had been waiting for him, hoping that he would come back, that he would be a part of her life. And he realized, in that moment, that she had probably been waiting her entire life, waiting for the father she didn't even know was missing. Later that afternoon, Cameron pulled into the orphanage parking lot, his hands clutching the steering wheel as if it were the only thing grounding him. The weight of what he was about to do felt almost unbearable. He had always thought of himself as composed, in control. But today, his world had been turned upside down. He was walking into a life he hadn't planned for, into a role he didn't know how to fill. Stepping out of the car, he made his way up the path to the orphanage. The playground was empty now, the children inside for the afternoon, but the air was filled with the distant sound of laughter and voices. He paused at the door, hesitating before pushing it open. The receptionist smiled warmly when she saw him. "Mr. West, she's been waiting for you." He nodded, unable to trust his voice. A staff member guided him down a hallway to a small room where Mia was waiting. His heart pounded as they approached the door, the nervous anticipation building with each step. He was about to meet his daughter, really meet her, for the first time. The door opened, and there she was, sitting on the floor, playing with a small, worn-out teddy bear. She looked up when he entered, her eyes brightening instantly. "Cameron!" she exclaimed, scrambling to her feet, the teddy bear forgotten on the floor. She ran toward him, her little arms reaching out. "I knew you'd come back." Cameron knelt down, instinctively catching her as she threw herself into his arms. For a moment, he didn't know what to say, didn't know how to act. He felt the softness of her small frame against him, her warmth, her trust. She held on to him as if she had known him forever, as if there had never been any question in her mind that he was supposed to be there. His throat tightened, emotion swelling in his chest. "I'm here now," "Mia," he whispered, his voice thick. "I'm here." She pulled back slightly, her blue eyes searching his face. "You're gonna stay, right? You're gonna be my dad?" The question hit him hard, almost knocking the air from his lungs. He had been so focused on understanding, on figuring out the truth, that he hadn't stopped to think about what came next. But as he looked into Mia's eyes, the only answer that mattered became crystal clear. "I am," he said softly, his voice breaking just a little. "I promise, I'm not going anywhere." She smiled, a wide, innocent smile that lit up the room. And in that moment, Cameron felt something inside him shift, something he hadn't even realized was missing. For the first time, he understood what it meant to be a father. The days that followed were a blur for Cameron, a whirlwind of emotions, realizations, and adjustments. Mia quickly became the center of his world, a bright spot in a life that had once been consumed by his career and reputation. For the first time in years, his focus shifted from the literary world's demands to something far more personal, being a father. But just as he was beginning to settle into his new role, something dark crept in, a shadow from Emily's past that refused to stay buried. It began one morning when Cameron received a letter, hand-delivered to his office. At first, he thought nothing of it. His name was typed neatly on the front, no return address, just a simple, unassuming envelope. He tossed it on his desk, intending to get to it after the endless pile of work that had accumulated during his time spent with Mia. Later that evening, as the office grew quiet and the city lights flickered outside his window, Cameron finally picked up the letter. Opening it absent-mindedly, he pulled out a single sheet of paper, the words scrawled in hasty, jagged handwriting. "You don't know the truth about Emily. Stay out of this or you'll regret it." Cameron felt a chill run down his spine. He read the message again, slower this time, as if he had misread it. But no, the threat was clear. The letter was short, to the point, and ominous. His first thought was to dismiss it. There were always people out there who thrived on stirring up trouble, but something about this felt different, personal. He leaned back in his chair, the weight of the letter sinking in. His mind raced, trying to piece together what it meant. Why now? And who would send this? His thoughts immediately went to Emily. What didn't he know about her? Cameron sat in the quiet of his office for a long time, staring at the letter, the tension building inside him. He had barely scratched the surface of what had happened to Emily. He had assumed that the mystery of her disappearance had been something tragic but simple. Now, it was clear there was more, much more, that he wasn't seeing. 2 days later, the second letter arrived. This time, the tone was even more threatening. Emily's death wasn't an accident. If you want to keep Mia safe, stop digging. Cameron's heart pounded as he read the letter, his eyes flicking over the words with growing dread. Emily's death wasn't an accident. His thoughts spiraled. What did they mean? He had assumed Emily had died under tragic but natural circumstances. But now, someone was implying it was far from that, suggesting foul play, maybe even murder. And then the last part of the letter hit him like a sledgehammer. If you want to keep Mia safe, the idea that Mia might be in danger because of something from Emily's past sent a wave of panic through him. Who was behind these letters? What did they know about Emily that he didn't? And more importantly, why were they targeting Mia now? He had so many questions and no answers. Every time he thought he was getting closer to understanding Emily's life and death, another mystery appeared, pulling him deeper into a maze of secrets. Cameron's mind was racing as he dialed James. He needed someone he could trust, someone who knew the publishing world as well as the hidden corners of its darker side. James picked up after a few rings, his voice casual as always. "What's up, Cam? Everything okay?" Cameron swallowed, trying to keep his voice steady. "No, it's not." He paused, glancing at the letter in his hand. "I need your help with something." Later that evening, Cameron met with James in a small cafe downtown. The place was nearly empty, the low hum of soft jazz music filling the silence between them. Cameron slid the letters across the table, watching as James's usually laid-back expression hardened into something more serious. James read the letters carefully, his brow furrowed. This is no joke, Cam. Someone's trying to scare you off. Question is, why?" Cameron shook his head, frustration bubbling to the surface. I don't know, but it's about Emily. These letters, they're saying her death wasn't an accident, and now they're bringing Mia into this, telling me to stop looking into what happened. James leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. You think it's true? About Emily? I don't know what to think anymore, Cameron admitted, rubbing his temples. But I can't just ignore this. If there's even a chance that something happened to her, I need to know. James was silent for a moment, the weight of the situation hanging between them. You've got to be careful, Cam. If someone's willing to send these kinds of threats, they're serious. And if they're right about Emily, you might be stepping into something dangerous. Cameron nodded, his jaw clenched. He knew James was right. Whoever was behind these letters wasn't bluffing. But he couldn't walk away now, not when there was so much at stake. Mia's safety was his priority, but so was the truth. What do we do? Cameron asked, his voice low but determined. James sighed, leaning forward with a serious look. We need to find out who's sending these letters. That's the first step. Someone from Emily's past, maybe. Someone who didn't want her talking. Cameron nodded slowly. Emily's past was becoming more and more like a labyrinth, filled with dark corners and hidden dangers. He had thought he knew her, or at least who she had been. But now, it was clear she had been caught up in something far bigger than he could have imagined. What about her friends? Her old colleagues? Cameron asked. Did anyone suspect anything back then? James tapped his fingers on the table, thinking, I'll look into it. There were always rumors about certain people in the publishing world, people who played dirty. But if this goes as deep as it sounds, we'll need to be careful, real careful. Cameron stared out the window, his mind racing. He was no stranger to challenges, but this felt different. There was more at play here than just uncovering the truth about Emily's life and death. The stakes were higher now, because Mia was caught in the middle of it all. As they left the cafe, the wind picked up, the cold October air biting at Cameron's skin. His phone buzzed again. Another message from the orphanage. Orphanage, Mia's been asking for you. She's excited to see you tomorrow. Cameron smiled, despite the dark cloud hanging over him. Mia, the one bright spot in all of this. He knew he had to protect her, no matter what. But first, he had to find out what really happened to Emily, and whoever was trying to scare him off. They were about to find out just how far Cameron West was willing to go to protect his daughter. Cameron stood outside the large, ornate building that housed the Literary Society, its imposing structure casting long shadows in the late afternoon sun. He had spent the last few days peeling back layers of Emily's life, unearthing fragments of her past that had been buried beneath time and silence. Now, he was at the place where it had all started, the center of her professional rise, but also, perhaps, the place where it had all gone wrong. He clenched his fists as he stared up at the stone facade, knowing that behind those polished doors were the people who had once surrounded Emily, editors, authors, publishers, and, if the rumors were true, some who had driven her into hiding. The threats, the letters, the whispers about Emily's death not being an accident. It all seemed to trace back to this place, a powerful circle in the literary world where secrets could be buried and reputations could be destroyed. As he approached the entrance, Cameron felt a surge of determination rise within him. He wasn't leaving until he had answers. Inside, the atmosphere was almost suffocating, the air thick with the scent of old books and whispered gossip. The society's main hall was grand, lined with portraits of famous authors and awards gleaming in glass cases. As Cameron navigated the maze of corridors, his heart pounded with a mix of nerves and anticipation. He had arranged a meeting with Margaret Shaw, a former colleague of Emily's, now a senior figure within the society. If anyone knew the truth about what happened to Emily, it was Margaret. The only question was whether she would be willing to share it. He found Margaret in her office, a spacious room filled with bookshelves that stretched to the ceiling. She stood as he entered, her sharp eyes observing him with a cool, practiced gaze. Dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, her presence commanded the room. Cameron sensed that she was a woman who rarely gave more than she received. Cameron West, she greeted him, extending a hand. Her tone was polite, but distant. I wasn't sure you'd actually follow through with this meeting. It's been years since you've had any dealings with us. Times change, Cameron replied evenly, taking her hand. And so do priorities. Margaret motioned for him to sit, and they settled into chairs on opposite sides of a grand wooden desk. She studied him for a moment, as if deciding how much to reveal. I assume you've come here because of Emily, she said finally, her voice softening slightly. It's been a long time since anyone has asked about her. Cameron nodded. Yes, I'm trying to understand what happened to her. The letters I've received, the threats, they all point to something bigger, something that started here. Margaret's expression remained unreadable, though her eyes flickered with something. Maybe recognition or guilt. She took a deep breath, her fingers lacing together in front of her. Emily was complicated. Brilliant, yes, but she had a way of attracting trouble. What kind of trouble? Cameron asked, leaning forward, his voice tinged with frustration. She disappeared without a trace, Margaret. Someone is telling me her death wasn't an accident. I need to know if that's true. Margaret looked away, her gaze falling on a framed photograph on her desk. A group of young writers, including Emily, laughing together at a book launch. She seemed to be weighing her words carefully, as if revealing too much could be dangerous. Emily got caught up in something she didn't fully understand. Margaret began slowly. She was ambitious, and she didn't like playing by the rules. That made her a target. There were factions within the literary community back then. Powerful people who controlled what got published and who got to succeed. Emily challenged them, and they didn't like that. Cameron frowned. What do you mean, factions? Margaret hesitated before continuing. You have to understand, this industry isn't just about talent. It's about influence, control. There were, and still are, groups that decide who rises and who falls. Emily was one of the few who saw through that, and she tried to expose it. Cameron felt his pulse quicken. Expose what, exactly? Margaret sighed, her expression growing darker. There were allegations of plagiarism, extortion, manipulation. The people at the top were stealing from the writers they claimed to support, taking credit for work that wasn't theirs, and threatening anyone who dared to speak out. Emily found proof of this, proof that could have destroyed some of the most influential figures in publishing. Cameron's jaw tightened. And that's why she disappeared? Margaret nodded grimly. She didn't vanish willingly, Cameron. They pushed her out, silenced her. And when she didn't back down, her voice trailed off, but the implication was clear. Cameron felt a cold shiver run down his spine. They killed her. I don't know if it was murder, Margaret replied, her voice barely above a whisper. But I do know that she was in danger. She tried to fight back, and it cost her everything. Cameron sat back, his mind racing. Everything Margaret had just told him painted a picture of a woman who had been brave, defiant, and ultimately crushed by forces much larger than herself. But it didn't explain why she had kept all of this from him, or why Mia had been left in the dark too. What about Mia? Cameron asked, his voice quieter now. Why didn't she tell me about her? Why didn't Emily reach out for help? Margaret's expression softened. Emily cared about you, Cameron, but she was afraid. She knew that getting you involved would put you in danger, too. And after Mia was born, well, she thought keeping you away was the safest thing for both of you. Cameron clenched his fists. He understood now. Emily had kept him in the dark to protect him, to protect Mia, but the guilt of not being there for his daughter still gnawed at him. He had missed so much, and now, he was playing catch-up in a world full of threats he barely understood. Margaret rose from her chair, walking over to one of the bookshelves. She pulled down a dusty, old ledger and set it on the desk in front of Cameron. These are some of Emily's notes, she explained. She kept records of everything, people, names, incidents. It might help you make sense of what happened. Cameron opened the ledger, flipping through pages filled with Emily's neat handwriting. There were lists of meetings, conversations, strange symbols and codes he didn't recognize. But one name kept appearing, circled over and over again. Jonas Mortimer. Who's Jonas Mortimer? Cameron asked, tapping the name on the page. Margaret's face paled slightly. Jonas was one of the worst. A literary agent who ran an underground network within the publishing world. He made his fortune by exploiting young writers, stealing their work and selling it to the highest bidder. Emily was close to exposing him. Cameron's stomach turned. If Emily had been on the verge of uncovering this man's operation, it made sense that she had been silenced. But it didn't explain why he was being threatened now. If Mortimer had already gotten rid of Emily, why go after him? Before he could ask, Margaret spoke again, her tone grave. "Be careful, Cameron. Jonas Mortimer is still out there. If he finds out you're looking into this, you'll be next." Cameron met her gaze, his eyes hard. "I'm not backing down. Whoever sent those letters, whoever's threatening Mia, I'm going to find them, and I'm going to finish what Emily started." That night, back at home, Cameron sat in the quiet of his living room, the ledger open on the coffee table in front of him. The apartment was dark, save for the soft glow of a lamp. Mia was asleep in the next room, safe for now, but Cameron knew that safety was fragile. The deeper he dug into Emily's past, the more dangerous things would become. He stared at the pages in front of him, his mind racing. Jonas Mortimer, the man who had destroyed Emily's life, was still out there, and he was pulling strings from the shadows. Cameron clenched his fists, a wave of anger rising inside him. He had to find Mortimer before it was too late, before more damage could be done. As he turned the page, something fell out of the ledger, an old photograph. He picked it up, his breath catching in his throat. It was a picture of Emily, standing outside a small house, holding a baby in her arms. Mia. Cameron's heart ached as he stared at the image, the weight of everything he had missed settling over him like a heavy blanket. But there was something else in the photo that caught his attention. A figure standing in the background, barely visible, watching Emily from the shadows. Cameron's blood ran cold. Whoever it was, they had been watching Emily all along. Cameron sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The photo of Emily and Mia rested on the passenger seat. The figure lurking in the background now burned into his memory. Whoever had been watching Emily back then, they were still out there, pulling the strings, and Cameron was closer to unraveling the truth than ever before. But that truth came with a cost. His mind was swirling with thoughts of Jonas Mortimer, the shadowy figure behind the exploitation and betrayal that had destroyed Emily's life. Margaret's warning echoed in his head. "Be careful. Jonas is still out there. If he finds out you're looking into this, you'll be next." And yet, here he was, about to dive headfirst into the danger that had taken Emily's life. He checked the address one more time. An old, run-down building in a forgotten corner of the city. It was Mortimer's last known location, a crumbling office he still supposedly operated out of, though its legitimate business front had been abandoned years ago. Cameron knew it was a long shot, but it was the only lead he had. Taking a deep breath, Cameron stepped out of the car, pulling his coat tight against the biting evening air. The building loomed ahead, its windows dark, and its faded brick walls covered in graffiti. There was no sign of life, but Cameron's instincts told him that someone was watching. Every nerve in his body was on edge as he crossed the cracked sidewalk, his footsteps echoing in the quiet. The entrance door creaked as he pushed it open, revealing a dimly lit hallway that smelled of mildew and dust. His heart raced as he moved cautiously through the corridor, his ears straining for any sound, any sign that he wasn't alone. At the end of the hallway, a flickering light illuminated a door with a faded brass plate. J. Mortimer, Literary Consulting. Cameron's pulse quickened. He hesitated for a moment, taking in the gravity of what he was about to do. Then, summoning his courage, he knocked firmly on the door. For a few heartbeats, there was only silence. But just as Cameron was about to knock again, the door creaked open, revealing a shadowy figure standing in the doorway. A man, older than Cameron had expected, but no less imposing. He wore a sharp suit, though it was slightly rumpled, as if he had been living in the office for too long. His eyes, cold and calculating, swept over Cameron with a flicker of recognition. "Mr. West," the man said, his voice low and oily, as if he had been expecting Cameron all along. "I had a feeling you'd come." Cameron's breath caught in his throat. This was Jonas Mortimer, the man responsible for destroying Emily's life. "I want answers," Cameron said, stepping forward, his voice steady despite the fear twisting in his gut. "About Emily Dawson." About what happened to her? Mortimer smiled, a slow, sinister grin that didn't reach his eyes. He stepped aside, gesturing for Cameron to enter the office. Of course. Come in. I've been waiting for this conversation. Cameron hesitated, his instinct screaming at him to leave, but he couldn't turn back now. Stepping into the office, he found himself in a small, dimly lit room cluttered with old manuscripts, filing cabinets, and stacks of papers. It was a far cry from the sleek, professional world Cameron had imagined Mortimer inhabited. Instead, it felt more like the lair of a man who had been cornered, desperate and dangerous. Mortimer closed the door behind him and moved to his desk, sitting down with an air of casual authority. "You've been digging into things you shouldn't," Mortimer said, his tone darkening. "Emily should have known better. I thought after she disappeared, this would all die with her." Cameron felt a surge of anger. "She didn't disappear, did she?" he said, his voice rising. "You had her killed, because she was going to expose you." Mortimer's smile faded, his eyes narrowing. "Careful, Mr. West. You don't know what you're talking about." Cameron's heart pounded in his chest, but he refused to back down. "Emily had proof that you were stealing from writers, exploiting them. You and your network. She was going to blow it wide open, and you couldn't let that happen." Mortimer leaned forward, his voice dropping to a cold whisper. "Emily was in over her head. She thought she could take on the big boys and win. She was wrong. But her death—" He paused, a twisted smirk curling at the corner of his mouth. "That wasn't my doing. At least, not directly." Cameron clenched his fists, rage bubbling up inside him. "Then who? Who killed her?" Mortimer shrugged nonchalantly. "She made enemies, Mr. West. Lots of them. She was too close to the truth, and someone decided she needed to be silenced permanently. I may have benefited from it, but I didn't pull the trigger." The room seemed to close in around Cameron as the implications of Mortimer's words sank in. Emily hadn't just been caught in a power struggle. She had been hunted, and now, whoever had killed her was sending threats to keep Cameron from exposing the same truth. "You're lying," Cameron spat. "You had everything to gain from her death." Mortimer stood abruptly, his eyes blazing with anger. "Do you really think you can win this, Cameron?" he snarled, his voice sharp. "Emily thought she could. Look where it got her. You have no idea how deep this goes. If you keep digging, you'll end up just like her, dead." Cameron took a step back, his heart racing. He realized in that moment that Mortimer wasn't bluffing. The man was dangerous, connected to people who could make things, and people, disappear without a trace. But he couldn't walk away. Not now. Not when Mia's safety was on the line. Before Cameron could respond, there was a sudden knock at the door, loud and urgent. Mortimer's face twisted in irritation. He strode to the door, but when he opened it, his expression changed instantly, from annoyance to fear. A tall, imposing figure stood in the doorway, his face obscured by the dim light from the hallway. Cameron couldn't make out who it was, but the tension in the room spiked immediately. Mortimer's body tensed, and for the first time, Cameron saw the cracks in his facade. The man in the doorway spoke, his voice low and menacing. "Mr. Mortimer, we need to have a word." Privately, Mortimer glanced back at Cameron, his face pale. Without another word, he turned and slipped out into the hallway, closing the door behind him. Cameron stood frozen, his mind racing. Who was that man? And why had Mortimer suddenly looked so terrified? He strained to listen, but the conversation on the other side of the door was muffled. He couldn't make out the words, but whatever was being said, it was clear that Mortimer was no longer in control of the situation. Minutes passed, each one more excruciating than the last, until finally, the door swung open again. Mortimer stepped back inside, his face grim, his eyes dark with fury. But the man was gone, as if he had never been there at all. "Leave," Mortimer said through gritted teeth, his voice barely controlled. "If you want to stay alive, stop digging. You have no idea who you're dealing with." Cameron hesitated for only a second before backing out of the office, the door slamming behind him as he stepped into the cold night air. His heart pounded in his chest, and his mind was a whirlwind of confusion and fear. But one thing was clear now. This wasn't just about Emily. Whatever she had uncovered, it was connected to something much larger, something far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. And now, Cameron realized with a sinking feeling, he had drawn the attention of the very people who had killed her. Cameron drove through the dark city streets, his mind in turmoil. The confrontation with Jonas Mortimer had rattled him more than he wanted to admit. There were too many unknowns, too many forces at play that he hadn't anticipated. Mortimer's warning echoed in his head. If you want to stay alive, stop digging. But Cameron couldn't stop. Emily's death, the threats against Mia, the shadowy figure that had confronted Mortimer. It was all connected, and the deeper he went, the more dangerous it became. He knew he was walking a tightrope, balancing his need for the truth with the growing fear that he was pulling his daughter into something dark, something he couldn't control. Mia. Her name brought him back to reality, grounding him in the midst of all the chaos. She was waiting for him at the orphanage, probably asleep by now. Cameron's heart ached at the thought of her. So small, so innocent, completely unaware of the storm that was brewing around her. He had to protect her, no matter what it took. When he arrived at the orphanage, the building was quiet. The soft glow of the hallway lights the only indication that the staff was still awake. Cameron made his way inside, feeling the weight of exhaustion settle over him. It wasn't just physical fatigue, it was emotional, mental. The burden of knowing that Mia was now his responsibility, that her safety depended on him, was overwhelming. As he walked down the corridor toward her room, he heard soft voices. One of the staff members was talking with Mia, who was still awake, her tiny voice carrying through the quiet night. "Will Cameron be here soon?" Mia asked, her voice tinged with hope and sleepiness. "Yes, sweetheart," the staff member replied gently. "He'll be here soon. Just rest for now." Cameron felt a lump in his throat as he approached the door. He hadn't realized how much she was counting on him, how deeply she trusted that he would come back for her. And now, more than ever, he felt the weight of that trust. He knocked softly and opened the door. Mia was sitting up in bed, clutching her worn-out teddy bear, her big blue eyes lighting up the moment she saw him. "Cameron!" she exclaimed, her voice filled with excitement and relief. He smiled, stepping inside and kneeling down beside her bed. "Hey, kiddo. Sorry I'm late." Mia shook her head, her little face breaking into a wide smile. "It's okay. I knew you'd come." Cameron felt a surge of emotion, his heart swelling with a mixture of love and guilt. He hadn't expected to feel so connected to her so quickly, but in the days since he had learned the truth, Mia had become everything to him. He reached out and brushed a stray lock of hair from her face. "You should be asleep by now," he said softly, his voice full of affection. "It's late." "I couldn't sleep," Mia admitted, hugging her teddy bear tighter. "I was waiting for you." Cameron's heart clenched. He had missed so much. Her early years, the moments when she had needed him, when she had waited for someone who never came. But now, she was waiting for him, and he was here. He sat down on the edge of her bed, unsure of how to navigate this new territory. Fatherhood was something he had never imagined for himself, and yet here he was, thrown into it without warning. Mia looked at him with those bright eyes, so trusting, and he realized that he didn't have the luxury of hesitation. She needed him now, more than ever. "Do you want to tell me about your day?" Cameron asked, trying to settle into the role of a father, trying to be present for her in a way he had never been before. Mia nodded eagerly, her face lighting up as she started talking about the games she had played with the other kids at the orphanage, the stories they had read, the art project she had made. Cameron listened, really listened, absorbing every word. Her voice was full of life, her excitement contagious. For the first time in what felt like forever, Cameron felt a sense of peace, like, in this moment, everything was as it should be. But beneath that peace was a lingering fear. The letters, the threats, they hadn't gone away. The danger was still very real, and Cameron knew that the closer he got to the truth, the more he would be putting Mia at risk. He needed to be smart. He needed to find a way to protect her from whatever was coming. When Mia finished telling him about her day, she looked up at him with those innocent eyes and asked, "Cameron, are you going to be my dad?" The question hit him like a punch to the gut. He hadn't expected it, but there it was, the raw honesty of a child, asking for something that should have been hers from the beginning. Cameron swallowed hard, his heart racing as he searched for the right words. He hesitated, then took a deep breath. I want to be Mia. I really do. Her face lit up with a hopeful smile. Really? Really, Cameron replied, his voice thick with emotion. But I've got a lot to learn. I'm not very good at this yet. Mia giggled, a soft sound that warmed his heart. That's okay. I can help you. I'm good at being a kid. Cameron smiled, feeling the tension in his chest ease slightly. I bet you are. She leaned forward, her tiny arms wrapping around him in a hug. Cameron froze for a moment, startled by the sudden affection, but then he hugged her back, pulling her close. Her small frame fit perfectly against him, and he felt the weight of his responsibility shift, no longer something to fear, but something to embrace. As he held Mia, the reality of his situation became clearer. He couldn't just be a passive observer in her life. He had to be active, present, the father she deserved, and that meant facing the dangers ahead with her in mind. When Mia finally let go and settled back into bed, her eyes drooping with sleep, Cameron stood up, pulling the covers over her. He stayed by her side until she drifted off, her breathing soft and steady. The room was quiet, and for the first time in days, Cameron felt a sense of calm. But as he stepped out into the hallway, the weight of everything crashed back down on him. Jonas Mortimer was still out there, and whoever had killed Emily was watching him now. The threats were real, and they were closing in. Cameron pulled out his phone, staring at the blank screen for a moment before sending a message to James. Cameron, I need your help. We have to take this to the police. Mia's in danger. James responded quickly. James agreed. But we need evidence, something solid. I'll start digging into Mortimer's network. Cameron leaned against the wall, exhaustion washing over him. He was in over his head, but he couldn't back down now. He had to protect Mia. That was the only thing that mattered. The next morning, Cameron arrived at the orphanage to pick Mia up. As she ran toward him, her face glowing with happiness, Cameron felt a swell of love, the kind that overwhelmed him. But with it came fear. Fear of what was lurking just beyond their grasp, waiting to strike. As they drove away from the orphanage, Cameron glanced at Mia in the rearview mirror. She was humming to herself, completely unaware of the danger that surrounded them. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, a silent vow forming in his mind. I won't let anything happen to you. No matter what it took, Cameron was going to keep that promise. He was her father now, and that meant protecting her at all costs, even if it meant risking everything. Cameron paced in his small apartment, the early morning light casting long shadows on the floor. Mia was still asleep in the next room, her peaceful breathing the only thing grounding him as he wrestled with the growing tension inside. The conversation with James last night had been brief but heavy. Mortimer was dangerous, but whoever was pulling the strings went even deeper. The only way to protect Mia was to uncover everything. But the fear was creeping in. Fear of what he might find, fear of what it would cost him. And now, the guilt weighed heavily. For years, he had lived his life, unaware of the storm brewing in Emily's world, unaware of the daughter who had been left behind. The letters, the threats, the darkness surrounding her death. It was all because she had been fighting something far bigger than either of them could have imagined. He pulled out the ledger Margaret had given him, flipping through the pages for what felt like the 100th time. His eyes kept coming back to one name, Jonas Mortimer, a literary agent with a reputation that had always hovered on the edge of scandal, but nothing concrete, until Emily had come close to exposing him. Cameron sat down at the table, his hands running over the pages of Emily's notes, her handwriting neat and deliberate. Every line was filled with her determination to uncover the truth, every page a testament to her courage. And yet, she had been silenced. He had to know why. He had to understand what had driven her into hiding, what had made her so desperate to keep him and Mia out of harm's way. Just as he was about to close the ledger, a page caught his eye, a list of names, most of them familiar from the literary world. But one stood out, circled in red multiple times. Andrew Summers. Cameron frowned, trying to place the name. He couldn't recall it from his own circle, but Emily had clearly been obsessed with this person. Underneath the name, she had scribbled something, 2 words that sent a shiver down his spine. Trust no one. Later that afternoon, Cameron met with James at a quiet cafe downtown. It was a place they often used for these secretive meetings, tucked away from the busy city streets. James arrived late, his expression grim as he slid into the booth across from Cameron. "I did some digging on that name you found. Andrew Summers," James said, keeping his voice low. "He's not just some random agent or publisher. Summers was the head of a group that controlled much of the underground dealings in the literary world. Plagiarism, extortion, blackmail. They were all involved, and Emily was trying to bring them down." Cameron's stomach churned. "And Mortimer was part of this?" James nodded, his expression hard. "Yeah, Mortimer was a key player, but Summers? He was the one pulling the strings. If Emily had exposed them, they would have all gone down." Cameron leaned back in his seat, his mind racing. So, this was the heart of it. The secret Emily had been trying to reveal. The reason she had been silenced. Summers had controlled everything, including the fate of writers like Emily who got too close to the truth. Emily was close, wasn't she? Cameron asked, his voice tight. "She almost exposed them." James nodded again. "She had the evidence, but before she could release it, she disappeared." The air between them was thick with the weight of that truth. Emily hadn't just disappeared. She had been erased, buried by the very people she had been trying to expose. And now, it was clear that whoever had killed her was still out there, watching, waiting for Cameron to make the wrong move. "What do we do now?" Cameron asked, his voice barely a whisper. He felt the fear creeping back in, but there was something else too, something stronger. The need for justice, not just for Emily, but for Mia, for all the years they had lost. James sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "We have to be smart about this. Mortimer's not the real threat. Summers is. And if he knows you're getting close, he'll come after you. He's ruthless, Cam. He's not going to let you or Mia walk away from this." Cameron clenched his fists under the table, the anger boiling inside him. "I don't care what it takes. I'm not going to let them get away with this." James gave him a long, searching look. "Then we need evidence, something solid that ties Summers to Emily's death. Without that, we're just playing a dangerous game." Cameron nodded, his mind already racing through the possibilities. The ledger, Emily's notes, they were a start, but it wasn't enough. They needed something concrete, something that would force Summers and his network into the light. "What about the letters I've been getting?" Cameron asked suddenly. "They're threatening me because I'm getting too close, right? Maybe there's something in them, some clue about who's sending them." James frowned, considering the idea. "It's possible. If they're trying to scare you off, they've already tipped their hand. But we need to be careful. If Summers is behind those letters, he's already watching you." Cameron felt a chill run down his spine. The idea that someone was watching him, watching Mia, was almost too much to bear. But he couldn't back down now, not when they were so close. That night, Cameron sat on the couch, staring at the pile of letters on the coffee table. Mia was asleep in the next room, her small form curled up under the covers, her teddy bear clutched tightly in her arms. He had tucked her in earlier, telling her a story to help her drift off to sleep. She had smiled at him, her eyes bright with trust and love, and for a moment, everything had felt normal. But now, as Cameron sifted through the threatening letters, the darkness crept back in. He picked up the most recent letter, the one that had mentioned Mia by name. His hands shook slightly as he unfolded it, reading the familiar, jagged handwriting. "Stay out of this, or Mia will pay the price." The words made his blood run cold. These threats weren't just aimed at him, they were aimed at his daughter. Whoever was behind this knew how to hit him where it hurt the most. Suddenly, he noticed something he hadn't caught before. A faint smudge of ink on the back of the letter, as if the person writing it had pressed too hard. Cameron's heart raced as he grabbed a magnifying glass from the drawer, carefully examining the mark. It wasn't just a smudge, it was a partial fingerprint. A surge of adrenaline shot through him. This was it. This was the lead they needed. If they could trace this fingerprint, they might be able to find out who had been sending the letters, and, by extension, who had killed Emily. Without wasting a second, Cameron grabbed his phone and dialed James. "I think I found something," Cameron said, his voice tight with urgency. "There's a fingerprint on one of the letters. We need to get it analyzed." James's voice crackled through the line, filled with equal parts surprise and determination. "Good. I'll make some calls. But be careful, Cam. If they find out you're this close, things are going to get a lot more dangerous." Cameron nodded, even though James couldn't see him. He glanced toward Mia's room, the quiet hum of her breathing just audible through the walls. "I know," Cameron said quietly, "but I can't stop now. Not when we're this close." The next morning, Cameron dropped Mia off at the orphanage, feeling the familiar pang of guilt as she waved goodbye from the front steps. She looked so small, so innocent, standing there in her little coat and backpack, completely unaware of the dark forces circling around them. But as he watched her disappear inside, Cameron made a silent vow. He would protect her. He would keep her safe from whatever danger was coming. And he would make sure that whoever had taken Emily from them paid for what they had done. As he drove away, his phone buzzed with a new message from James. "James, I've got someone who can run the print. We'll know soon enough who's behind this." Cameron's heart pounded as he read the message. The truth was coming, and when it did, nothing would ever be the same. Cameron sat in the dim light of his kitchen, the early evening shadows stretching across the walls. His fingers drummed anxiously on the table as he stared at his phone, waiting for the call. The fingerprint on the letter had been sent for analysis, and James had promised to get back to him as soon as they had any leads. It had been days of living in a state of constant tension, each hour feeling like a battle between patience and paranoia. Every time Cameron left the apartment, he felt eyes on him. Every time he tucked Mia in at night, he fought back the gnawing fear that someone was watching, waiting for him to slip. The threats had become more personal, more direct, and now, he felt the danger closing in around them like a tightening noose. Mia's laugh echoed from the living room, breaking his thoughts. She was playing with the few toys he had bought for her, her world blissfully free from the shadows lurking in his. Cameron forced a smile whenever she looked his way, doing everything he could to shield her from the storm that was building around them. But how long could he keep her safe? His phone buzzed, snapping him back to the moment. He grabbed it, his heart racing as James's name flashed on the screen. "James!" Cameron's voice was tight, filled with a mix of hope and fear. "Cam," James replied, his tone serious. "We've got something. The fingerprint on the letter. It's not Mortimer's. It belongs to someone else." Cameron's breath caught. "Who?" James hesitated for a moment, the weight of his next words clear in the pause. "It belongs to Andrew Summers." Cameron's stomach lurched. Summers, the man pulling the strings from the shadows, the one who had destroyed Emily's life, and now was threatening his. The pieces were finally falling into place. "Are you sure?" Cameron asked, barely able to keep his voice steady. "It's a match," James confirmed. "Summers has been behind this the whole time. He's the one who sent the letters. And he's the one who wanted Emily dead." Cameron gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. The name, Andrew Summers, had haunted Emily's notes. He was the reason she had been silenced, the reason she had gone into hiding. And now, he was coming for Cameron and Mia. "Where is he?" Cameron demanded, his voice rising with anger. "We have to stop him." James's sigh crackled through the line. "It's not that simple, Cam. Summers is dangerous, and he has a lot of people in his pocket. You can't just confront him. You need to be smart about this." Cameron stood up, pacing the kitchen. "I don't care how dangerous he is. He killed Emily. He's threatening my daughter. I'm not letting him get away with this." "I get it, I do," James said, his voice calming but firm. "But you need evidence, something that ties him directly to Emily's death. We can't just go to the police with a fingerprint on a threatening letter. It's not enough." Cameron's mind raced. Summers had been meticulous, staying hidden in the shadows for years. There was no doubt he had covered his tracks well, but Cameron knew that there had to be something. Some piece of evidence Emily had found that tied Summers to everything. Her notes, the ledger, the letters. There had to be a connection he hadn't seen yet. Emily must have had something on him, Cameron said, more to himself than to James. She wouldn't have stopped digging unless she was close. There has to be proof somewhere. James's voice softened. Then we need to find it. Whatever she had, it's the key to taking Summers down. But you have to be careful, Cam. Summers is dangerous, and if he knows you're still digging, he'll come after you. Cameron's jaw tightened. He wasn't afraid of Summers. Not anymore. Not after everything he had learned. The fear had turned into something else. Something colder, more determined. He had to protect Mia, and the only way to do that was to finish what Emily had started. I'll find it, Cameron said, his voice hard with resolve. Whatever it takes. That night, after putting Mia to bed, Cameron sat at his desk, the flickering light of his computer screen casting a faint glow in the dark room. He had pulled out every piece of information he had on Emily. Her notes, the ledger, the letters, even the photograph of her with Mia as a baby. He combed through everything, searching for the missing piece, the clue that would tie Summers to Emily's murder. Hours passed, the clock ticking away in the background, but nothing stood out. Cameron's frustration grew with every page he turned. He was close, he could feel it, but there was something he wasn't seeing. He stared at the photograph again, the one of Emily holding Mia in her arms, the shadowy figure in the background barely visible. The figure, someone watching, waiting. Could it have been Summers? Had he been tracking her even then? Cameron squinted at the photo, feeling a spark of recognition in the figure's posture, the way they stood, hidden in the distance. His gut told him it was Summers, but it wasn't enough. He needed something concrete. Then he remembered something. Cameron grabbed the ledger and flipped to the page where Emily had scribbled Andrew Summers' name over and over again. His eyes scanned the page, and there, at the bottom, almost hidden in the margin, was a series of numbers, coordinates. His pulse quickened. Coordinates? He grabbed his phone and quickly typed them into a map app. The location popped up deep in the countryside, miles away from the city. A small, isolated house in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't just a house, it was a safe house. Emily's safe house. Cameron's heart pounded in his chest. This was it. This was where she had hidden everything, where she had kept the proof that could expose Summers. She must have left it there, knowing that one day, someone would need it. Without thinking, Cameron grabbed his coat and his keys. He needed to go there, now. The drive to the safe house felt like an eternity. The road stretched out before him, winding through dark forests and desolate fields. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the rhythmic beating of his heart, pounding louder with every mile. When he finally arrived, the house was exactly as he had imagined. Small, secluded, and hidden from the world. Overgrown bushes surrounded the property, and the windows were dark, like no one had been there in years. Cameron parked the car and got out, his breath visible in the cold night air. He approached the house cautiously, his heart racing with anticipation. If Emily had hidden something here, it was the key to everything. He tried the front door, but it was locked. His hands fumbled as he reached into his pocket, pulling out the small key that Margaret had given him back at the Literary Society. Emily had left it with her notes, and now, Cameron realized its significance. It was the key to this place, to the answers she had hidden away. The door creaked open, and Cameron stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, the scent of abandonment hanging in the air. He flicked on the small flashlight he had brought with him, casting a beam of light through the darkness. The house was simple, just a few rooms, sparsely furnished. But as Cameron moved through the house, he felt Emily's presence, as if she had been here just yesterday, hiding from the world, waiting for someone to find her. In the back room, Cameron found it, a small, locked trunk tucked away in the corner. His heart pounded as he knelt down and unlocked it, the hinges creaking as the lid slowly opened. Inside were stacks of papers, old notebooks, and a flash drive. Cameron's hands shook as he pulled them out, his flashlight illuminating the words scrawled across the pages. It was everything. Everything Emily had been working on, everything she had uncovered about Summers and his network. And there, at the bottom of the pile, was a letter addressed to him. Cameron's breath hitched as he unfolded the letter, Emily's familiar handwriting bringing a lump to his throat. Cameron, if you're reading this, it means I couldn't finish what I started. But you can. Everything you need is here. I'm sorry I kept you in the dark for so long. But I did it to protect you. I did it to protect Mia. I hope one day you'll understand. You always believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself. I never told you, but I loved you, Cameron. I always did. Take care of Mia. She's the best part of both of us. Finish this for all of us. Love. Emily. Cameron's vision blurred as tears filled his eyes. He sat there in the quiet of the room, the weight of Emily's words settling over him. She had sacrificed everything to protect him and Mia, and now it was his turn to finish what she had started. With the evidence in hand, Cameron knew exactly what he had to do. Cameron stood at the edge of the safe house, his heart heavy and his mind racing. The trunk's contents were scattered across the floor, the weight of Emily's final letter pressing against his chest like an anchor. He had everything he needed now, the evidence that could take down Andrew Summers, the truth that Emily had fought so hard to uncover. But the cost of that truth weighed on him. Emily had sacrificed her life, and now it was Cameron's responsibility to finish the fight she had started. The cold night air cut through him as he stepped out of the house, the letter from Emily still clutched in his hand. He stared into the distance, the quiet of the countryside broken only by the faint rustling of the wind in the trees. His mind was filled with the enormity of what lay ahead. He had the proof that could expose Summers and his network, but doing so would put Mia in even greater danger. Summers wasn't just a man to be exposed. He was someone with deep connections, someone who could strike back hard if Cameron made a mistake. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was James. "Cam, we've got a problem," James said, his voice tense. "Summers knows. He's coming for you." Cameron felt his stomach drop. "What do you mean? He knows?" "There's been movement in his circle, rumors. He knows you found something. If you don't move fast, you're not going to get another chance." Cameron glanced back at the house, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He had to protect Mia, no matter what. But he also knew that walking away now meant Summers would get away with everything. Emily's sacrifice would mean nothing, and the threat to Mia would never truly disappear. "I've got the evidence," Cameron said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. "I'm going to the police." James hesitated. "You sure about that? Summers has people everywhere. If you go to the wrong person—" "I'll take that risk," Cameron interrupted, his resolve hardening. "This ends tonight." Back in the city, Cameron parked his car outside the precinct. The streets were quiet, the city bathed in the yellow glow of streetlights. The folder containing Emily's documents sat on the passenger seat, thick with the proof that could unravel Summers' empire. But the gravity of the situation gnawed at him. He knew that stepping into that police station meant putting everything on the line. His safety, his future with Mia, everything he'd come to care about. He hesitated, his thoughts drifting back to Mia, to the smile she had given him before he had left her at the orphanage that morning. She trusted him. He was all she had now, and for the first time, Cameron truly felt what it meant to be a father. His chest tightened with a fierce determination. He couldn't fail her. Not now. Steeling himself, Cameron grabbed the folder and stepped out of the car. He walked into the precinct, his heart pounding in his chest. At the front desk, he was greeted by a weary officer who glanced up from her paperwork. "I need to speak with someone about Andrew Summers," Cameron said, his voice firm. "It's urgent." The officer raised an eyebrow but nodded, gesturing for him to follow her to a back office. As they walked through the precinct, Cameron's eyes darted around, the paranoia creeping back in. He couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were on him, that Summers' reach extended further than he could see. They entered a small room, where an officer in his late 40s sat behind a cluttered desk. His nameplate read Detective Harris, and the look in his eyes told Cameron he'd seen too much in his career to be easily surprised. "Have a seat," Harris said, his voice calm but curious. "You said you had something on Summers?" Cameron sat down, placing the folder on the desk between them. "Emily Dawson," he said, his voice steady. "She was a writer, and she was killed because she was trying to expose Summers and his network. I have the proof she left behind." Harris's eyes narrowed as he opened the folder, flipping through the pages. Cameron watched, his pulse quickening as Harris's expression shifted from mild curiosity to grim realization. This is serious," Harris muttered, his tone darker now. If this is real, it's going to blow the lid off everything. It's real, Cameron said firmly, and Summers knows I have it. He's coming after me, and my daughter. Harris leaned back, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. You realize, if you're right about this, Summers won't just sit back and let this happen. He'll fight back, and it won't be pretty. I don't care, Cameron replied, his voice low but resolute. I just want to protect Mia, and I want justice for Emily. The room fell silent as Harris considered the weight of what Cameron was saying. Finally, he nodded, closing the folder with a heavy sigh. I'll take this to the right people, Harris said, but you and your daughter will need protection. I'll put in the request for witness security. Make sure you're both safe. Cameron exhaled, relief washing over him like a wave. For the first time in days, he felt like he was finally one step ahead of Summers. The fight wasn't over, but now, at least, there was a chance, a real chance to stop him. 2 days later, Cameron stood in the hallway of the orphanage, his heart pounding as he waited to pick up Mia. The past 48 hours had been a whirlwind. Interviews with detectives, meetings with lawyers, and the constant presence of security officers watching his every move. The police were closing in on Summers, and Cameron had been kept in the loop, watching as the pieces of Emily's puzzle fell into place. Summers had tried to bury the truth, but now it was out in the open, and there was no going back. The door to Mia's room opened, and she came running toward him, her face lighting up with pure joy. Cameron knelt down, scooping her up into his arms as she giggled, wrapping her small arms around his neck. Her laughter was infectious, and for a moment, Cameron let himself believe that everything was going to be okay. Are we going home now? Mia asked, her blue eyes wide with innocence. Cameron smiled, his chest tight with emotion. Yeah, kiddo, we're going home. He walked outside, Mia in his arms, the weight of the past few weeks slowly lifting from his shoulders. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the city, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Cameron felt at peace. As they drove away, Mia hummed quietly in the back seat, completely unaware of the danger they had just escaped. Cameron glanced at her through the rearview mirror, his heart swelling with love and a fierce sense of responsibility. Emily had given everything to protect Mia. She had fought a battle Cameron hadn't even known was being waged. And now, it was his turn to protect their daughter, to build the life Emily had wanted for her. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy. There were still questions, still challenges. But Cameron knew one thing for sure. He wasn't running anymore. He had found his purpose, his reason to fight. And with Mia by his side, he was ready for whatever came next. As the city faded into the distance behind them, Cameron turned his attention to the open road ahead, the sun dipping below the horizon, casting everything in shades of gold and crimson. For the first time in a long time, the future didn't seem so uncertain. It seemed like a new beginning,